sure how much it's impacting here, but there's this kind of fashion throughout the world to think of maths as kind of like in Australia we are really struggling to fill mathematics education programs at university. What's everyone running off to do? Film and television, arts, business, commerce, you know, fun stuff. So we have this really huge looming crisis in terms of, you know, I think we're going to be like, we're 18,000 engineers short a year. Everyone who, and they're mostly boys, but everyone who graduates from the University of Queensland with an engineering degree who is warm and vertical gets a job. I don't know how long warm and verticals just hang on to that job, but they all get a job. Okay, we have this serious maths crisis, and I think it's because this is very fashionable to think of maths as hard. You know, you've actually got to use your forebrain, that bit. And it's not used very much, because if you think of all the people playing all the video games all their lives, they're using this bit. They're not using this bit. This bit is atrophying. You know, and you find that. I mean, I find that in middle age. I go to do a sum and I'm going, but I force myself. So the interesting thing about maths is that this 1998 study showed that students who did really practical kind of mathematics in gardens, instead of just thinking it as an abstract concept, something that was hard, they sort of learned to use that mathematical skills are actually tools to quantify and analyse connections among natural and social cultural systems. And I think that real message is lost in a lot of maths education, that maths is a tool, it's a fantastic tool, and it's actually the foundation of our whole civilization. Like, we're sitting here in this building confident the engineer who put this building up did his maths. Otherwise we wouldn't be standing here, would we? If we had any doubts, we'd be running. You know, so I mean, it's maths to me is like really interesting, and I think that if you are interested in this would be one sort of thing that you might like to really pick up on and see. Okay, the other thing is, of course, that gardening's very strong about active learning. And we all know that active learning builds confidence. And we do want confident learners. And students are not passive, they're just not sitting there doing a worksheet. They're out there getting physically and mentally involved. Now, there is a little problem, and we do have to mention the problems in that a lot of students who haven't done any gardening in their life, who have spent all their time kind of touching all these fake plastic things that we live with, you know, who live fabulous lives online, you know, who get up and before they finish yawning have tweeted, text and Facebooked and whatever all before, you know, the yawn is finished. These guys sometimes don't actually want to go to the garden because the garden is unfamiliar. And then you're saying like things like play with dirt, play with real dirt. And remember that dirt has a bad reputation. You know, we all know those ads where people endlessly run around spraying, and you're a very good mother if you wipe the spray and you've killed 99.99% of the germs, and that makes you a terrific mother. And okay, interestingly enough, the reverse is true, that to be a terrific mother, you need to actually get your kids to play in the dirt. I told some my students just yesterday that I had two very good friends who had polio. One of them died of complications, late adult complications of polio. And it was because their mothers didn't let them play in the dirt. the great polio epidemics were due to the fact that people didn't play in the dirt anymore and weren't getting that low-level increasing immunity. So then we all invented this vaccine, which we now all take, and everyone takes their polio vaccine. It doesn't matter that we don't play in the dirt, because we found a medical solution to it. But you know, it is something that you have to deal with, is people's relationship to dirt. Okay, the therapeutic aspect of gardening has also been explored in the literature. I love this quote: gardening is cheaper than therapy, and then you get tomatoes. It doesn't have an attribution. So the big American study found evidence of students who actively engage in environmental projects appear to have better developed cognitive ability than their peers. Now that's because they have to do a lot of active reasoning, and it's really interesting. I don't know how much you know about this learning thing, but if you do things with your hand, it goes to your brain. And I still to this day, if I was sitting in the audience listening to me, I'd be writing. Or maybe I'd be putting up my hand and asking for the PowerPoint, you know, but I'd be writing, and because you write and it goes to the brain. If I don't write it down, somehow it doesn't go to the brain. I might type it, just doesn't lodge. And you get to an age where that's kind of a problem, so I'm always writing. So it's interesting that students who actively engage, now not the kind of kid that sits there going like this, eye rolling, gardens are uncool, not that kid. The kid who gets in there and is actively doing stuff is more likely to have a better cognitive, higher, more well-developed cognitive abilities for their age, become much better at information synthesis, and ask more thought-provoking questions. So there seems to be, and you know, as we all know, the brain science is really, really kind of on a charging, expanding. It's kind of hard to keep up with the latest in brain science, but I think maybe some brain science will one day show us how that mechanism works. What is the relationship between active involvement in a formal curriculum activity and then greater cognitive development? But also what's important for us as educators is that the teachers tend to be more enthusiastic. They have better relationships with their students. They're excited by the learning opportunities. In fact, a lot of the SEER data just is people saying, oh, I was so excited to participate and go outside. You know, it's fun for teachers as well. Okay, so we've also got, I got that slightly wrong here. There's several reoccurring benefits: motivation, excitement, increased teamwork, increased student bonding, improved relationships with adults, including the parents and community members who come in to help and who volunteer to be involved with the school. And the interesting thing about these studies is that the type of garden doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to matter whether you're doing your traditional composting and growing your vegetables, or whether you're doing a sensory garden, or you have a water garden, or a frog garden, or it's the community action together that seems to have make the outcomes. Now this I found this really interesting. This is also strongly featured. The research evidence shows that there can be harmony in a garden. And this is very important. There's a lot of research that comes out of places like the Middle East, where you get conflicting cultures, like living it like in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a really interesting place to read about in terms of the science and environmental education, because all the kids are at school together, and yet everyone's been at war for certainly longer than I've been alive, and yet they find that they're in doing the environmental projects and the garden projects, you can get a very marked decrease of ethnic tension, and you get increased verbal and physical interaction between students from conflicting cultural groups. You might have come from historically conflicting cultural groups. What I think it was Hoffman called the decreased ethnocentrism. And so there's a number of garden studies. This one was done in America, and this was done in Germany. You know, there's a lot of ethnic tension places all around the world. You know, because the actual students working together in the garden show a decrease, and I think that's one of the most interesting things to come out of the literature. Is that there can be harmony in a garden, a decreased tension between different groups of students from historically conflicted backgrounds. All right, there was no size effect. The size of your garden is not related to your academic and social learning outcomes, meaning you can start small. You don't have to jump in and like do a full permaculture garden with all the bells and whistles in your first year. You can start with a few plants in a pot with a very small plot. You know how some classrooms have their own little plots? You can start small. Now, this is a very positive thing out of the literature as well. Gardens teach how a plant goes from seed to plate, and different types of gardens can all have the same heightened educational outcomes, whether they're like vegetable or fruit gardens, whether you're doing the full-on permaculture thing with the ducks and the fish and you know, several layers of plantings, whether you've got a non-organic or organic garden, whether you've got a school or community garden, whether it's inside or outside the gate, whether you're simply growing flowers and herbs or you've grown an aesthetic garden for young children or something. It doesn't seem to matter. What matters is the garden itself and the activities you do in the garden, not what kind of garden it is. Okay, and I love this. I'm going to finish shortly. This is a very famous tree study where these researchers phoned people in about 13 or 15 different US cities with very high population densities. And they got about 2,000 or 2004 urban dwelling adults to actually participate in this study. And they went through a detailed phone survey. I can't remember who sponsored this because it was a big study, you know, a multi-million-dollar study. And they found that after they crunched all the numbers and did the regressions and, you know, put everything through everything, they found that active gardening in childhood was the most important predictor of whether trees had personal values to the adults in a densely populated environment. Now that has real sustainability implications if you think about it. Okay? You're thinking about developing a community where if you plant a tree, that tree is going to live out the full extent of its life, whether that's 80 years, 50 years, 160 years, 250 years. What's the most likely thing? What's the best way of protecting that tree in an urban centre? Is to have gotten everyone to garden when they were young, so the tree actually becomes valued. Now, it's expensive to go around planting trees in a big city. It's expensive. So, you know, to me it seems logical that concomitant with the planting of the trees, you're doing the kind of work in education that is likely to increase the value of adults respecting those trees. If that makes sense. Does this all make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so, and I found that that's just an amazing study, and because the numbers are so large, we can really count on the reliability of these findings. So, this actually is a picture of my favourite forest. It's up at Cooper's Creek in the Daintree. So there's lots of contemporary ideas. This is an old picture of my balcony. These things now are like way up here. I have to repot them. They got a bit enthusiastic. But I like this picture because it shows how the plant is really a collector of sunlight. You know, it's just a collector of sunlight, and they're really miracles, really, how they just stand there and collect all these photons and turn all these photons into life. So the contemporary ideas, you'll have seen them, the balcony gardens, the vertical gardens. Like there's a lot of vertical gardens going in around Singapore. There's a subsidy. The only problem with vertical gardens is they're very expensive to construct and they have to be put in by an engineer. So children really can't construct vertical gardens. So the really only function at the moment for vertical gardens, given the engineering restrictions, is that vertical gardens are more an aesthetic backdrop, if you like. It's very difficult for very young children to put in any kind of workable or long-lasting vertical gardens, and I don't recommend it because of the engineering involved. I haven't even put a vertical garden into my own. It's just too expensive in Australia at the moment. It costs like $600 for like half a square metre or something. It's very expensive. That cost will come down, and maybe someone will invent a child-friendly vertical garden structure, but we might have to wait a couple of years for them. Rooftop gardens are fantastic. There's lots of material in Singapore about the beautiful rooftop gardens. Replica landscape gardens, they're very popular too, but they're often very expensive. What is happening in far north Queensland, I've been working with schools on frog gardens. Now frog garden is your frogscape. You go in and you plant all these plants that native frogs like, and you put in a frog pond, and then you put in a frog pond, a cane toad barrier, because you know we have that horrible cane toad plague, and you bring frogs into the schoolyard, which is incredibly exciting. I've done that at Barnell Frere State School, and I think of the other one in a minute, Gordonvale. Another thing that I have done is I did this at Whitfield State School, is put in a butterfly garden where you plant all these trees for the caterpillars. Now this all worked perfectly until we had a really destroying experience, and that was when a group of hoons came through and chopped all the plants down and mashed all the caterpillars. And this was for early childhood, you can imagine. There were so many tears, I was crying most of them. You know, I was just like, all this effort, and all this goodwill, and all this wonderful thing happening, and vandalism. So that's the problem with butterfly gardens, is the frogs can hide, but the butterflies really can't. And if you've got any problems with hoons, because you can't, unless you're going to enclose them. But you know, we couldn't enclose them, they were just like over a chain link fence. And it's a bit sad. But that's another thing I do, just to be honest. I don't know what the vandalism rate is like in